Whenever I have an opportunity to speak to top corporate management, like managing directors, finance directors, purchasing directors, HR directors, I have only one message for them. Cancel all events. Don't just reduce the budgets, cancel everything, because there's a good chance that they lose money. End of the year, your profit is less because of the event. And if they make money, I am convinced you could make twice as much money for the same budget. So just cancel everything. And then you start receiving applications from people who want their budget back. And you ask them 3 critical questions to which you want some really good answers. First question is, how does your event fit with other corporate strategies? If it's a customer event, how does it support our marketing strategy? How do other marketing initiatives support your event? If it's an internal event, how does it fit into our HR development project? Without strategic context, there will be no event. That's question number 1. The next 2 questions, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to tell me about half an hour from now. If I do my job well, you will all know what those 2 questions are. So if I don't disappoint you, please don't disappoint me. Okay? You need to figure out 2 questions before I finished. In the meantime, I will tell you a story. Or before I even tell the story, I will give you a little exercise. For the next half hour, I want you to have a personal case study in your mind. I want you to think about an event, any kind of event. It can be an exhibition or a team building or a product launch or a customer hospitality, whatever. I want you to have your personal event case study. It's best if it is an event which you are currently planning. It's going to happen sometime in the future. So maybe after today it will be a better event. Or at least one that you have some knowledge of. And it should be an event of some importance where you think it would be good if we could measure really well the results, or maybe even the ROI for this event. Are you all thinking about your personal event case study? Yeah? Nod if you do. You will have one in your mind. I want you now to have an imaginary conversation with the event owner. Now, who's the event owner? The event owner is that person, or God forbid, committee, is that person who at the end of the day decides what's going to happen at the event, how are we going to use the budget. That's usually the event owner. You're having an imaginary conversation with the event owner and you say to him or her, what are our objectives for this event? Why do we spend money on it? Why do we organize it? And I want you to write down 2 or 3 objectives that they will give you. Not what you think they should say, but what you think they will say. The meeting owner could be your client or it could be your internal client. So if I'm quiet now for a minute, can you write down 2 or 3 objectives? And then I'm going to ask you to just give me 2 or 3 examples in English, please. Okay? I'll be quiet for a minute. What are the objectives of your event? Why do we organize it? So what's the objective?
Well, I will try. The first one is, well, it's quite simple, the team building.
Team building.
Yes,
that's fine. I just want one from you. Building a team, it's an internal event. You want to inspire and educate and make them work harder and love their managers even more.
It's a loyalty, increase of sales.
Loyalty, increase of sales, which means you want your customers to be even happier customers and not even consider.
In many cases, we organize events to motivate, to recognize, and to educate.
Motivate, recognize, and educate to get more out of your workforce and to make them give you that more happily. How about this table?
To increase brand awareness.
Yes. So you have a customer event or potential customers. You want to generate leads because they become aware of your products and services. Typically what you do at exhibitions, maybe it was an exhibition. And we'll have a last one here. Give us one.
To gain customer loyalty.
Customer loyalty. Same again, a lot of events, a lot of customer events are not just necessarily to sell more products, but to make sure they continue buying from you. These are all very good objectives. Nothing wrong with them. But we will see in a minute how they all fit into one particular category of objectives. So, now I'm going to tell you my story. This didn't happen to me, it happened to a colleague of mine called Mike. He had a phone call one day from someone who said, I work for a cleaning franchise company. We have franchisees up and down the country. If I can have a clicker, that will work. Here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. We have franchisees up and down the country. They clean schools and offices and hospitals. We provide the global branding, and they buy all their cleaning equipment and materials from us. So it's a traditional franchise model. Once every year, we have a big franchise meeting. It's 1,000 people, mostly the general managers of these cleaning contractors. It's a 3-day event, which means that many of them travel one day to get there, and they travel another day to get home, so we take them out of the office, out of work, for nearly a week. And the event is all smoke and fireworks and big stage sets, and it's costing an absolute fortune, and we pay for that. Now, recently in the management team, we started discussing, how do we get the money back? Is it really worth all this time and money to have this big event? Maybe we should do something else with the money. Can you measure the ROI, he said to Mike. Well, of course, that's the kind of question people like Mike and I love to get on the phone. And Mike said, yes, that's what I do for a living. I'd be happy to do that. Great, said the other chap. And you know, the timing's perfect because this year's event happens in only 2 weeks. So we can show you the program and then you do your questionnaires or whatever you do to measure the ROI. So the deal was done. Mike came along for a briefing meeting with a group of managers just a couple of days later. There was quite a lot of managers in the room. I think they were all intrigued by this person who claimed he could measure the ROI. And Mike started the meeting by asking a very simple, straightforward question. He said, what exactly do you know that these participants should do differently after the event in order to make more money? Now, I think you'd agree that was just a common sense question. Mike just assumed that was the purpose of the event. Didn't need to know anything about ROI to ask that question. It has since become known as the Mike question. But the room went quiet for a little while, and then one of them said, well, that's not such an easy question to answer because we have different categories of participants in the room. We have some big cleaning contractors, we have some small companies, we have some that have just started up. We even have some building maintenance consultants in the room, so it depends who you're talking about. Fair enough, said Mike. There's only one way to deal with that. We have to go category by category. And so the exercise started. And they had lots of ideas. They need to learn how to use social media in their marketing. They need to learn how to negotiate long-term contracts so they don't have to pitch for work all the time. They need to invest in more modern and safer equipment for cleaning windows in tall buildings and so on. Lots of good ideas. But Mike had a follow-up question. Whenever they suggested something, Mike would say, well, but why don't they do that already? I mean, if you know, if they did that, that would make more money, why don't they do it already? What's stopping them? Or put differently, how can you be sure that when they get back in the office after the event, they will do exactly that? So that wasn't such an easy question to answer. The first one was easier. And as they were coming up to lunchtime, the room was just filled with frustration. And one of them stood up and he said, you know what? This event we have planned less than 2 weeks from now is a totally different event. It will not achieve all those things that you now made us tell you it has to achieve in order to return a good value for everybody. Now, I think we can all imagine this situation. You're less than 2 weeks away from a senior management event with 1,000 people and smoke and fireworks. It's not when you want to start changing things, is it? They changed everything. First, they went through the list of speakers and they said, what will he or she speak about? What will they learn from that? And what will that make them do? And if the answer to the final question was not on one of the flip charts now covering the walls of the meeting room, then why was the speaker in the program? They cancelled more than half the speakers less than 2 weeks before the event. I don't know what they've told them, but it was probably something like, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but we've just realized we have no idea why we put you in our program. They cancelled half the speakers. They went back to the venue, and luckily they could get a lot more meeting rooms because now they needed a breakout room for social media marketing tools, and they needed another breakout room for long-term contract negotiation, and they needed exhibition space for modern window cleaning equipment. It became a totally different event, and all because of Mike's very simple, common sense question. Now, this event illustrates what we call the general principle of value creation. There is only one thing which, as a consequence, adds value to the stakeholders. So they have to change their behavior in a way which adds profit to the bottom line, either by increasing sales or making the organization more cost effective. And we have to achieve this particular behavior at the lowest possible cost. That is what event planning is all about, and nothing else. There are two important words. First one I've mentioned already is the word to do. It's capitalized. It's so physical. It isn't just feeling or thinking. You know, making feeling and thinking doesn't create any value. Inspiring your employees is a waste of time. Educating your employees or your customers, it's a waste of time. It's only what they do differently when they have become inspired which gives value. Ask any HR manager. They send their operators to learn how to do their job better. And they go on this very good training course and they come back at their workplace and they do their job exactly the same way as they did before. If there was no change in behavior, there was no value. The other important word is the word stakeholders. Every event has a number of stakeholders. There's a meeting owner or an event owner, so usually that's clear. Then maybe you have exhibitors or sponsors, speakers and venues. The participants are always stakeholders. At least they have their time at stake. Sometimes people ask me, Elling, can you measure the ROI for this event, or can you evaluate this event? And I say, no, nobody can. Events as such don't have value. You have to tell me first on behalf of which stakeholders. If you have an event with, say, 5 different stakeholders, they want participants maybe to do 5 different things to give value to their bottom line. You don't even know what data to collect if you're going to satisfy somebody and nobody. You have to say, for which particular stakeholder am I evaluating the event? And you could calculate 5 different, totally different ROIs from the same event. So we have to be clear about stakeholders. Usually, the event owner is the main stakeholder, and that is clear. The mistake we often make is to think that the participants are the most important stakeholders. Very often they are not. They're just an instrument for the event owner to change behavior and create value. So that's a general principle. It applies always. I don't care if it's a Christmas dinner. If you can't set some objectives for what people should do differently after the Christmas dinner, you have only one thing to do. Cancel. I mean, I'm not saying you necessarily need to measure everything, but if you don't even have a theory of how this particular event is going to change someone's behavior, then you have no idea why you organize it. Only behavior matters. We had an excellent example of this today. Let's go back to this conversation with Mike and the other chap. Remember, he said, we're not quite sure how we get the money back. So in a way, he had an implied objective for return on investment. It was break-even return on investment. That's 0%. It's like you put €1 in the bank in January and you just get €1 back in December. That's 0% return on investment. Same thing. Now, we don't always, it's not very ambitious, of course, to say break-even, but it's a good place to start. I mean, say you have a customer event and you're going to increase sales. You know the profit margins of your sales, and just do a little quick mental exercise. How many more products do we need to sell because of this event alone and nothing else in order to pay back our costs? And if you're comfortable with that, and if you have no other idea, well, double it. Say we want 100%. We want to double our costs. And then you start figuring out, working backwards, what needs to happen in order to achieve that. So we set ROI objectives. Before we get to calculating the ROI, we need to know two things. We need to know what value did the event create, and how much money did it cost to create it. If we have that information, what's the value we created minus the cost of creating it? What's the difference between those two numbers called? Starts with a P in English anyway. Profit. Every corporate event has its own profit and loss account. And profit is the same as ROI. The return on investment is simply that profit number as a percentage of the cost of the event. And then you have the magic ROI percentage number. But you need what we call impact objectives first. By how much should we increase sales, for example? What will be the value of making our organization more effective? And those objectives we call impact objectives. Think of impact on the bottom line. Then we have the behaviors that causes that impact. We've already talked about that. If you ask a behavioral psychologist, how do you change people's behavior? He or she will tell you, before you can have a change in behavior, you need to have a cognitive change. Something needs to change in their minds, consciously or subconsciously. And a cognitive change is just a fancy word for a learning experience. So we set objectives for the learning experiences during our event, which will change the behavior. And we call them, of course, learning objectives. We have different types of learning. We have 4 different types of learning. We have what we call information learning. When I say learning, you probably think of that first, learning new information or knowledge. And there's always information learning at nearly all events. Information about a company or a product or a strategy or the experiences of other participants. Sometimes we learn how to do something. We learn a skill. Sometimes we have skills learning objectives. Doctors go to a medical congress and they learn how to perform a new diagnostic procedure. That's a skill. Then we have something we call attitude learning. Now, my wife is a school teacher in Norway, and at her school there are children from 43 different nationalities. In her class of 26 this year, she has 14 different nationalities. And my wife says it's extremely important that the children learn good values and attitudes. Changing people's values and attitudes is also a learning experience. Your branding event to make customers think more highly of your brand is an attitude learning experience. Your motivational event is an attitude learning experience. And you can read any textbook on cognitive science and you will find these 3 different categories of learning, maybe with different labels on them. But we add a 4th one for events. It's a special case of information learning. We call it relationship learning. It's not exactly the same as we mean by networking. It's like 1/2 of networking. It's that getting to know another person. Why do salespeople want customer hospitality events? to build trust and liking. So we have 4 types of learning. Do you remember? The 4th one is easy, it's there. First it was information, skills, attitudes, relationships. And you can take the agenda of your case event or any other event, and every point in the agenda you will be able to put into one or more of these learning categories. Because we need specific learning to happen to change the behavior which as a result will create our impact. To achieve learning, we need what we call a good learning environment. We usually measure, I don't know about you, I've been to many events where networking is important and the music is so loud you can't talk to people. Have you ever experienced that? That's an example, a simple example of a bad learning environment. We usually measure the learning environment by measuring the satisfaction of the participants. We want them to be satisfied on 2 dimensions. We want them to be satisfied with hospitality. I was seen and welcomed and I felt relaxed and the food was good and the buses came on time. We know all about hospitality. And we want them to be satisfied with the content. I came here to network with customers. Well, did they have opportunity to network with customers? Or I came here to learn about ROI. Well, did I learn about ROI? But the learning environment is something more and even more important. What we call our instructional design, the quality of our speakers. Do we allow participants to think and reflect and discuss what they learn? Or do we just bombard them with bullet points? That's learning design. And we know a lot about that now. So we need a good learning environment for learning to happen. And last but not the least, we need to have objectives for the target audience. I mean, if you have the wrong people in the room, you can forget about the rest. It's not going to work. And very often we don't pay enough attention to target audience. Often we just count numbers. I think one example is typically product launches. Product launches are often fancy events. There's good food, everybody's there, it's a nice half day out of the office. But do you apply the BANT criteria? B-A-N-T. Did they have a budget? Did they have the authority to spend it? Do they have a need for our product, all these people at our product launch, within a time that makes it meaningful for us to entertain them now? Those are the target audience for your event. So we have a number of different types of objectives. We put them into what we call the ROI pyramid, and its foundation, the ground floor where it rests, is of course the target audience. We call that level 0, the target audience, and we set objectives for who needs to be in the room. These are the people who could potentially change their behavior to give us impact. Then we have the learning environment. If we have a good learning environment, we're not surprised when we measure that they remember our product features, we change their attitudes, they built new relationships. And if they learned what we defined they needed to learn, we won't be surprised when we measure that the behavior has changed. And the behavior has changed in such a way that as a result, it increases an impact on our bottom line. And impact minus cost is profit, and then you easily calculate the ROI. What you look at now is essentially the ROI methodology. It's like a chain reaction from the bottom up the pyramid. If one chain is broken, you don't get the value. When we plan the event, we will normally start at the top and find out, well, how is this event going to impact our bottom line? What do participants need to do? And what do they need to learn to do that? I mean, how can you possibly design the content of the event without knowing what the participants are going to do afterwards? How can you design for learning if you don't know what behavior you're going to drive? It's meaningless. But how often do we charge into creative ideas for engagement, and we find interesting speakers, and it's so natural that we charge into this level 2. all of you had objectives from your managers, which were learning objectives: to inspire, to brand, to connect, to remain loyal. Now, remain loyal, what level is that? To remain loyal is a level 4 objective. That's bottom line. It's the same as increased sales. This is the ROI methodology. Now, we have a nuisance factor when we come from learning to behavior, because before we can measure behavior, we have to give them some time to behave. Target audience and learning environment and learning we can measure immediately after the event, our exit questionnaire, but then we have to wait a while until we measure the behavior and the impact and the ROI. We don't always have to measure everything right to the top. We start from the bottom. But most of our events, long before we get to the ROI number, we know if this was a good event or not. Once we understand we had the right people, good learning environment, they remembered, or maybe even we measured they did, you present those results to your management or your client, and your managers will say, well, you don't need to tell me anything more. I know my business. If you achieve those things, I know this was a good event. I don't know if the ROI was 50% or 500%, but that's just a nice to know information. It doesn't really matter. So you don't have to measure everything, but you always have to set objectives. How can you work as a proud professional without objectives? How do you know what to do if you don't know what to achieve? Alice in Wonderland said many good things, and one thing she said, if you don't know where you're going, you will end up somewhere else. I think a lot of our events end up somewhere else. This procedure is fairly straightforward and simple, but then some people say, well, what if I have an event and I run an advertising campaign at the same time? Remember context, support by other initiatives. So I have my customer event to drive sales, and I have an advertising campaign to drive sales, and sales go up. How do I know if it was because of the event or because of the advertising? When I judge event awards, this is one of the most serious crimes I see. When the event managers take credit for results obviously created by something else. So we always have to isolate. Certainly when we get to measure impact, the real value, we have to isolate what we measure from other influences. We have many different ways of doing that. We can always do that. The best method is always to do what we call a control group experiment, like they do in pharma. You have a new medicine, and you give the new medicine to one group, and you give a placebo to the other group, and you see who gets well quicker. We do the same with events. We have one group of people who attended the event, and then we carefully select another group of people who didn't, and we measure the differences in behavior. Now, that can be complicated sometimes. It can be a big project sometimes. You need skills to do that. And it's not always convenient. You want to invite all your customers. You don't want to leave some out because they're going to be a control group. So we use other, much simpler and quicker methods, and they're methods of professional estimation. And nearly always we can come up with a credible estimate of how that value we measured was divided between different influences. So that's really not a problem. Then we have another problem sometimes if we're going to go all the way and measure the financial return on investment. What if our event is designed to develop management skills? Well, then we have to convert better management into money. Now, again, you have to take my word for it. That's not as difficult as it may sound. There are lots of rules of thumbs. There are books and books of case studies. Lots of lonely professors around the world have attacked this problem of putting a money value on something which was not monetary to begin with. So it's not going to stop you from calculating the ROI. So we're talking about return on investment. That's a financial measure. It's based on real money and nothing else. What if our organization, our event owner, belongs to a not-for-profit organization? Does it make sense to measure return on investment if you're not for profit? It doesn't really. We have to find the equivalent of ROI for a not-for-profit organization. Any corporation, whether you like it or not, the reason why they exist is to make money and to increase the value of the shareholders. So we have to find the equivalent objective for a not-for-profit organization. What would that be? What would be the ultimate purpose of existence for the Cancer Society, for example? Why do they exist? What is their purpose? I used to work quite a lot for the European Heart Association. And at that time, there were about 130 people in that organization, and you could ask any of them, what is the mission of your organization? And they would all say, to reduce suffering from heart disease in Europe. So we don't do that final calculation. We stop with the impact, and the impact for them would be to reduce suffering from heart disease. How many lives did your medical congress save? And that's where we stop. Now, this ROI methodology is not some idea I've come up with. It's been developed over more than 30 years, mostly by a chap called Jack Phillips in America. It started in the training industry. There are more than 20 different disciplines where it's applied. Meetings and events is just one of them. In fact, it was only applied to meetings and events about 10 years ago for the first time. It's used in all sorts of other disciplines and industries. There are more than 30,000 trained practitioners around the world in the ROI methodology in 54 countries. And if you want to read a book about it, there are more than 60 books to read. And if I show you some of those book titles, you will understand how it's applied to very different types of situations. You have ROI in technology development. You have ROI in coaching. You have ROI in organizational development. You have ROI in sustainability projects. The book is called The Green Scorecard. Any situation in life where you create value by changing the behavior of people, you can fit the ROI pyramid on that project. So I think with these credentials and the very simple principles that I've outlined today, I don't see why this should not be your standard operating procedure for how you set objectives and how you measure results for any kind of event. Now, to make sure that we really understand this behavior bit, because that is so incredibly important, I want you to go quickly back into the office of your event owner.
All right, if it's a sales event and if we would like to hire our product recognition, if I want to sell a product, I want the audience who visited the event to come back to the office and maybe to share the information with the authorities so that, yes, I've seen the product and why don't we buy it?
We call it the cascading.
Yes.
Because I was just going to say, well, feeling happy to work for the company doesn't create any value. But since they feel happy, they work harder, they cooperate better now with those people in the other departments. They don't spend so much on the coffee machine because they're just dying to get back to their desk. We can't talk to you anymore now. When you have, say, a sales competition and those who sell most for the next 3 months are invited to come to this fabulous trip to Marrakesh or whatever, or Nova Scotia or wherever. So we have an incentive program. The interesting thing about the incentive event is that the behavior which creates the bottom line value happens before the event even takes place. It's the competition to win a ticket which increases the sales. But then, ask. And now sometimes I ask my clients, and sometimes I lose business because I ask this question. Tell me, exactly what do these people do differently when they sell more? Why don't they sell so much every day? I mean, do they work till 8 o'clock at night instead of 6 o'clock? Or maybe they just work for themselves to increase their sales and they don't support the other team members? Or maybe they just think short-term sales and not long-term customer relationships. And what about those who don't win year after year? How do they feel? But if you have good answers to those questions, because we kicked off this incentive by a new sales training program, and to drive people to apply what they just learned in order to sell better, we're going to reward them. Well, that's an excellent incentive program. But just taking the best people and give them a prize, think carefully. Why don't they do that every day? Could you have spent that money on management training and they would encourage them every day and they would have top performance every day instead? Now, for my two questions. Have you all got, remember the first one was, how does it support other strategies? What's the strategic context of your event? Now we want two more questions which these top managers are going to ask before they give anybody their budget back. Can I have one of them? What else do you need a damn good answer to before you consider giving them the budget back? What is the most important thing to create value from the event? Did somebody say something? How about the lady in blue?
Have an objective, the most important.
Yeah, but an objective, if you say you must have an objective, okay, I've got 6 different categories of objectives. What kind of objectives do you mean? I mean the learning objective. Please tell me, before I give you your budget back, exactly how these people will change their behavior after the event in order to make more value from the company. Explain that behavioral change mechanism to me. And what's the third question? What's the third question? Do we have to tell you? Tell me. Exactly what learning experiences are you planning to put into your event to make that behavior change? What do you need them to do? And how are you going to make them do that? If I get good answers to those 3 questions, context, change in behavior, and learning experience which will drive that change, you can have your budget back. Do you need more? Are you sure it's enough? Because now I'm confident that your event will create value. Next time, if you're in the supply side, when you pitch for a contract for a client, and you read the inquiry, it's full of level 2 objectives, and you go back to the client and said, well, we've made this assumption, these are the people that should be attending the event. We think these people could potentially change their behavior to give you value. This is how we plan to make them do that. And here are our creative ideas and our creative concepts for each of those learning experiences. You can have your budget back. And remember, finally, this pyramid applies to you today. Why are you not in your office, earning money for your companies? What are you doing here? Just having a good time? If you go back in your office tomorrow and you do nothing different, or next week, because you were here today and learned from all these best events, then it was a waste of time. You should have been in your office today earning money for your company. Sorry, I don't want to finish on a sour note. I'm sure you have lots of things to take away. I'm just saying, when you get to your desk in the morning, just make a little list. Remind yourself, what did I learn yesterday from all these best projects, and how can I now find ways of applying that new knowledge to my own events? Thank you very much.